We've all heard the stories, haven't we? Tales of humans abducted in the dead of night by alien ships, experimented on, and returned to Earth with hazy memories and strange scars. It's a terrifying thought, being at the mercy of beings more advanced, more powerful, and far less compassionate than us. But tonight, I want to turn that idea on its head. Because what if, just what if, the roles were reversed? What if it wasn't aliens preying on us, but us preying on them? What if the real monsters weren't out there among the stars, but right here wearing our faces, carrying our flags? This is the story of Sergeant Marcus Kane, a man who went to the stars and did unspeakable things. A man whose name is burned into my mind because I read the reports, his reports, and they still haunt me. Before we dive in, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I've got more stories like this: horror, the supernatural, the unexplained. If that's your thing, hit the bell icon so you won't miss the next nightmare. Now, let me take you to a place you won't soon forget. It all started with a file, a seemingly ordinary mission report buried deep in the interstellar archives. I wasn't even supposed to find it. It came up by accident while I was researching something else. But once I opened it, I couldn't look away. The reports were written by Sergeant Kane, a decorated soldier sent on a reconnaissance mission to a newly discovered planet in the Delta V quadrant. At first, his entries were standard fare: planetary surveys, cataloging flora and fauna, and observing the native species. The planet itself sounded like a dream: lush forests that glowed faintly under a canopy of stars, rivers that shimmered like liquid silver, and skies painted in hues of gold and violet. Kane described it as a paradise untouched by the greed and violence of humanity. But the Trinnal, the planet's native inhabitants, were what caught my attention. He described them as gentle, luminous beings about half the size of humans. Their skin glowed softly, and they communicated through harmonic songs that Kane said were unlike anything ever heard by human ears. He called them a miracle of evolution. Yet as I read on, the tone of his entries shifted. The admiration faded, replaced by clinical detachment. He stopped calling them Trinnal and started calling them subjects. He stopped writing about their songs and started writing about their anatomy. One report in particular made my stomach turn. Subject 12 displayed remarkable regenerative properties when exposed to controlled lacerations. Further testing required to determine limits. Lacerations. He was cutting them open. I couldn't get the reports out of my mind. Days turned into sleepless nights, and the words in Kane's logs replayed in my head like a broken record. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know the truth. I commandeered a small ship, unauthorized, of course, and charted a course to the planet Kane had described. I expected to find the thriving Trinnal settlement Kane had written about in his early reports, but when I arrived, I found nothing. The air was heavy, thick with a metallic tang that burned my throat. The once lush forests were dying, their glowing leaves dull and brittle. The villages, if you could even call them that anymore, were silent. Their structures crumbled as if abandoned in haste. The first signs of life I encountered were not the Trinnal. No, what I found were shadows of what they had once been. The first attack came as I walked through what looked like a central gathering area. Broken instruments lay scattered on the ground, their delicate strings severed. It was as if the Trinnal's songs had been silenced forever. Then, out of the shadows, it came. At first, I thought it was an animal, something predatory that had always existed on the planet. But as it charged, I saw the remnants of glowing patches on its deformed skin. This wasn't a natural predator. This was a Trinnal, or what was left of one. Its limbs were twisted and elongated, its jaw unhinged unnaturally wide. It screeched, a guttural, broken sound that chilled me to the bone. I barely had time to raise my weapon before it was on me. I fired, the sound of the blast echoing through the empty village. The creature fell, its body convulsing as black ichor oozed from its wounds. As I stood over it, I noticed something horrifying. Its glowing patches weren't glowing naturally anymore. They were pulsing, like a heartbeat. I realized then that whatever Kane had done to these beings, it had destroyed them completely. When I finally reached Kane's base, I hesitated at the threshold, staring up at the jagged, metallic structure rising like a scar against the planet's vibrant skyline. It didn't belong here. The base was a crude, utilitarian fortress, a stark contrast to the natural beauty of the alien world. But it wasn't just the base itself that unnerved me. It was the feeling that clung to the air, a suffocating weight, like the planet itself was recoiling from what had been done here. The ground around the base was blackened and cracked, as if scorched by some unnatural force. Strange vines coiled through the fissures, pulsating faintly with an eerie, sickly green glow. I couldn't tell if they were plants, organisms, or something in between. The air smelled of iron and decay, and with every step, I felt like I was walking deeper into a graveyard. And then I saw the totem. At first, I thought it was just debris, a mound of twisted metal and organic material piled near the entrance. But as I got closer, I realized the truth. It was a mass of bodies. The Trinnal, or what was left of them, had been fused together in a grotesque sculpture. Their glowing patches of skin, once soft and soothing, now pulsed erratically, casting faint, flickering light across their deformed faces. Some of them still moved, their limbs twitching weakly, as if trapped in a perpetual state of agony. My stomach churned, but I forced myself to press on. The entrance to the base was wide open, as if inviting me in. But stepping inside felt like crossing into another world, a world devoid of light, hope, or sanity. The first thing I noticed was the sound. It wasn't silence. It was worse than silence. The base was filled with faint, unnatural noises, mechanical whirs, distorted cries, and a constant low hum that seemed to vibrate through the walls. Every sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but together they created a symphony of unease. The corridors were narrow, their walls lined with jagged, rusted metal. The flickering lights overhead cast long, shifting shadows that seemed to move on their own. I swear I could feel eyes watching me, though I was alone. At least I thought I was alone. The first room I entered was some sort of lab. At least it might have been a lab once. Now it was a charnel house. The walls were lined with glass tanks, each one filled with a sickly green fluid. Inside the tanks were things. Some of them were still vaguely recognizable as Trinnal. Their luminous skin had turned a dull gray, and their bodies were bloated and misshapen. Others were unrecognizable, twisted amalgamations of flesh, bone, and machinery. I stared at one tank where a Trinnal's torso had been fused with mechanical arms, its glowing patches replaced with blinking red lights. Its eyes were open, staring straight at me. I turned away, my stomach heaving, but the horrors didn't stop there. The tables in the center of the room were covered with surgical tools, blades, saws, and devices I couldn't even begin to name. They were all coated in a dark, viscous substance that I prayed wasn't what I thought it was. And the smell was unbearable. A mix of burnt flesh, chemicals, and something else, something organic and rotten. As I moved deeper into the base, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. At one point, I turned a corner and nearly jumped out of my skin. There was a figure standing in the shadows. I froze, my hand on my weapon, but the figure didn't move. Slowly, I approached, and as the light caught it, I realized it wasn't alive. It was a Trinnal, or rather, a mockery of one. The creature had been propped up against the wall, its body held together by wires and metal plates. Its head had been replaced with some sort of mechanical apparatus, and its glowing patches had been carved away, leaving raw, exposed flesh. It was like Kane had tried to remake them in humanity's image. But instead of creating something new, he had only created abominations. I backed away, my skin crawling, and continued down the corridor. The deeper I went, the worse it got. The cages started appearing about halfway through the base. They lined the walls, each one containing a different experiment. Some were alive, though I hesitate to call it living. They writhed and gnashed their teeth, their distorted forms barely recognizable as anything that had once been alive. One cage held a creature with 3 heads, each one crying out in a different tone. Another contained a Trinnal whose arms had been replaced with long, serrated blades. It paced back and forth like a caged animal, its glowing patches flickering erratically. But it wasn't just their appearances that horrified me. It was their eyes. No matter how deformed they were, their eyes were still the same, bright, glowing, and filled with pain. I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed into the empty corridor, "Kane, what have you done?" My voice echoed, but there was no answer. When I finally found Kane, he was waiting for me. The room was massive, its walls covered in monitors displaying his experiments. The images on the screens were worse than anything I had seen so far. Live feeds of creatures writhing in agony, their bodies contorting as if trying to escape themselves. And there, in the center of it all, was Kane. He sat at a desk, his back to me, his fingers dancing across a keyboard. He didn't even turn around when I entered. "You made it," he said, his voice calm, almost cheerful. "I wasn't sure you would." I didn't respond. Couldn't. The words caught in my throat as I stared at the man who had caused all this. He looked normal. Not the mad scientist I had imagined, but an ordinary man in a military uniform. That somehow made it worse. "Why?" I finally managed to choke out. "Why would you do this?" He turned then, and I saw his face. It was calm, expressionless, as if he didn't understand the gravity of what he'd done. "Do what?" he asked, genuinely confused. I gestured wildly at the screens, the cages, the horrors surrounding us. "This, all of this, you've turned a paradise into a nightmare." Kane shrugged. "They were weak. I made them stronger." It was then that I noticed it. On the back of his neck, just below the collar of his uniform, was something alive. A parasite, its tendrils burrowing into his skin, pulsing faintly in time with his heartbeat. "Kane," I said slowly, "what is that on your neck?" His hand twitched as if to reach for it, but he stopped himself. For a brief moment, I thought I saw fear in his eyes, but then it was gone, replaced by that same blank indifference. "It doesn't matter," he said. "None of this matters. What I've done here, it's bigger than you or me. It's progress." Progress. That word was the last straw. I lunged at him, my rage boiling over, and the fight that followed. Well, let's just say it's a miracle I'm still here to tell you this story. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that I was too late. Kane might be gone, but his legacy remains. The creatures he created, the lives he destroyed, they're still out there haunting that dead world. And sometimes I wonder, was it the parasite that made him a monster? Or was it always inside him, waiting for the right moment to emerge? What do you think? If you're still with me, thank you for listening. If this story shook you like it shook me, hit that like button, share it, and most importantly, never forget, sometimes the real monsters don't come from the stars. They come from us. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.